Okay, welcome to our ninth international webinar. We welcome people coming in now, both on Zoom and on Facebook. So people are joining literally as I speak. I'm Keith Newton, the Secretary General of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, and it's my pleasure just to open the session. Thank you so much for joining us. As I say, it's our ninth international webinar. The subject is living in interesting times, which sums up a lot of what today and the current period is all about. I'm going to pass on the chairing of the session to Jan Steenberg, who will introduce our special guest and speaker for today in a moment. Jan is our Honorary Secretary and a trustee of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. He's been a member since 1995, is chair of our International Education Standards Committee, and he also heads up Europe and the APAC region for Tata Consultancy Services. So has all the background and expertise to chair our session today. So Jan, can I pass over to you to introduce our speaker and run the session today?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Keith. Indeed, first of all, I'm very honored to say that we got one of my favorite speakers on this webinar today. I've known Sean for quite a few years, not only as an award-winning keynote speaker in supply chain and disruptive technologies, but also as a personal friend, and I'm very pleased to say that. One of the things I think which has sort of been groundbreaking for Sean in his career was when he finally got around to finish his book Transition Point, which I've read with great interest, and I'm sure some of you have as well, which of course is not just about what might happen, but also what has happened. A lot of research in it, where Sean is exploring what has been wave after wave of disruptive change in our civilization and in our society, but also using that to extrapolate into the future based on sort of current trends. For that reason, it's probably no surprise that Sean is a visiting fellow at Cranfield University. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport and a well-known transformation advisor for a number of bodies and organizations. So he has certainly all the credentials to be able to talk to us today and present his views on interesting times. Some of you may find those interesting times views, if you like, a little bit disturbing, but I think Sean at one point said, he's not sort of peddling in happy endings, he's peddling in facts. So over to you, Sean, and to the rest of you, enjoy this. This is going to be a tour de force from one of the masters in the trade.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for such a gracious introduction. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen, make sure everyone can see and hear everything. Okay. Yeah, once again, Jan, thank you very much for that. Presentation today I'm going to go through it's a bit of a, as I say, a bit of a tour de force, as Jan implied. I'm going to go through quite a lot of material quite quickly, but I think it's what I try to do in my presentations is to show the connections between a number of different things rather than just highlight certain aspects. And I'd like to take you back, I think, at the start of this to this particular term here. Now, this kind of term, the VUCA, which is a military term that was sort of co-opted around about 2000 to describe the sort of post-financial crash world that we was in. And it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I was interested to understand why things were so VUCA and so disruptive at that particular point in time, which led me into the research behind the book. And I guess if we can compare the VUCA years of the 2010s to what it felt and looked like, I guess it would look a little bit like that. So the last decade, really, people who are coming out of it, probably specifically in the supply chain, would be looking and feeling like that. And of course, then we handed over to 2020, where we thought things were, new decade was upon us and things would be so much easier and smoother now that we've got out of that disruptive period, only to find that we've had probably more disruption this year in the last decade combined, if not the last 20 years combined. So the question I was really intrigued by was, I see all this disruption around us. I see the pace of change increasing. I hear all of the top consultancies and the keynote speakers saying, it's a VUCA world. We need to adapt to a VUCA world. But what I didn't see anyone say or hear anyone say was why. I mean, why is it VUCA right now? When I started work in the 1980s and 1990s, it didn't feel like this. The level of speed and change didn't feel like this. So why is it VUCA now, but it wasn't then? And that was one of the things that really intrigued me. And then, of course, once you start to dig into those sorts of things, you realize that actually, in order to understand why it's so disruptive right now, I need to also understand why it wasn't disruptive previously. And I need to understand whether or not there's been other previous periods of disruption. And before you know it, you spent 6 years of your life, your pension and all your savings writing a rather large book that investigates not only the technological events that are happening right now, but rather than the social and economic, causes of these changes and also the ramifications, because the why question is incredibly important, but actually what that leads you to is the so what question that says, if we understand what's happening and why it's happening, then what's the implications of it? Where is it taking us? And where is it taking us from a business perspective? Where is it taking us from a economic perspective? And where is it taking us from a societal perspective? And of course, then the other question is, what comes next? What comes after that? Now, one of the primary elements of my research focused around why change is cyclical and not linear. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have periods where there doesn't seem to be much change, and we have periods where there seems to be a lot of change, and this has been going on for a while. And it's all to do with something called Kondratiev waves, or effectively now known as waves of creative destruction. And the term creative destruction was coined by an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter, who took the work of Nikolai Kondratiev, who first identified this phenomenon and tried to understand the causal factors behind it. And the causal factors really are all around innovation, and they're around entrepreneurship and sort of macro level innovations that occur at certain points in time, specifically when money moves towards it, that creates whole new paradigm shifts in the way we do things. So from the automobiles replacing, the horse and wagon, all the way through to the computers replacing, the typewriters and the handwritten messages. So we have these sort of macro shifts of technologies that diffuse across societies. And in the upswing, they have huge amounts of change where there's lots of people experimenting with this new technology, new business opportunities are arising. But there is a downside to this in that, these new waves of creation tend to destroy the old ways of doing things. So other businesses, old businesses that are wedded around the old ways of doing things ended up being disrupted. And as we move towards the point whereby these new innovations become commoditized and diffused across society, so that now effectively there's nothing new in them anymore, then money moves to more exploitation methods. So money moves to try and make money from money, or it looks at the current ways of working and says, how can we do what we do but do it more cheaply? And that's when you see things like the offshoring movement, for example, where we're focusing on leaning and efficiencies in the supply chain rather than reinventing the supply chain. Now, there's been 5 of these to date, and the 5th one collapsed at the financial crisis in 2007, 2009. And as you can see here, each one generally creates a new power source, a new transport mechanism, and new communication mechanisms, which when combined, create whole new industries. And the forces of creative destruction, as I just mentioned, means that the creation of these new industries usually disrupts and sometimes destroys the old ways of doing things. One of the things that we're picking up on is that these waves are getting stronger, faster, and higher. And there's a number of reasons for this. The first is that, they're just simply, the frequency is increasing. There's a shortening period of time between these technological waves. there's a much bigger impact in the amount of innovation as more and more brains are being involved. So if you take the first industrial revolution, for example, that was specifically focused around Great Britain. So there was only, you know, the wealthy in Great Britain were the people who were working on the innovations that were ultimately ended up changing the world. But now we have the brains of people around the world due to globalization. These innovations diffuse much quicker than they did previously, so the speed at which they spread. So again, go back to the first industrial revolution, you know, innovation spread around the world at the speed of sailboats, whereas now they spread around the world at the speed of digital, so almost instantaneous. And finally, the scope. So the scope of the impact, its number of countries impacted by innovation due to globalization is massively increasing it. So these waves are getting much more disruptive, much faster, and much more impactful. And we can see that when we look at something like the Standard & Poor's 500, the length of time a company is likely to sit on the S&P 500. And you can see the sort of wave effect that has on it as well. And you can see that it's just decreasing all the time. And in fact, by the time we get to sort of 2025, I think the number of years a company will be on the S&P 500 on average, it should be down to about 14. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. For a long time, I've been presenting on this and I've been saying we are in the transition period between waves. We're kind of not anymore. We are now very much in the sixth wave now, and we're in the upswing period. And that's good and bad. It's good and bad in so much as I think we now know what the technologies are that are going to reinvent the ways we do things in the sixth wave. But the bad thing is actually, these are the really disruptive times. These are the times where actually things really struggle. We have this sort of big gap between, you know, the rate of technological change and our ability to actually process that change. And that means, unfortunately, that we see a lot of scenes like this. So in the first industrial revolution, we saw scenes on Paris and the terror where, you know, there was a big level of inequality and people revolted against that. Now we see the same sort of scenes on Paris or in the US, in Portland or Philadelphia, where there is, you know, a protest because these are the disruptive times. This is the time when all the wars happen, all the revolutions happen. You know, there are major power shifts. These happen to be, if you look back through history, the points when we see the most social inequalities and social disruptions. Now, all this constant change and chaos creates a time of uncertainty and unpredictability. So we're beginning to see that things we call black swan events aren't so black swan anymore. They're not so uncommon. And what we're also finding that these black swan events tend to lead to black swan reactions. So, for example, with the COVID pandemic, we found immediately we had a shortage on toilet paper, which was a completely unexpected reaction to the fact that we had a virus that actually had no gastro impact. So it didn't require toilet paper, but ultimately it caused a shortage in toilet paper. And that created black swan consequences. As we saw people run out of toilet paper, people started to use things like, for example, wipes and kitchen paper to do things that used to use toilet paper through, which blocked a lot of sewages in places around the world, specifically in the UK. So we had, it's not just that you have to be able to expect the black swan event, but now actually there might be reactions to that event that you can't expect, which create consequences to that reaction that you can't expect. So it becomes a very, very disruptive time. And what we see is a time of power battles and paradigm shifts. And the sort of paradigm shifts in the supply chain are, in this wave, is that we're moving from the company being in control to the consumer being in control. We're moving from single channel to omni-channel. We're moving from the consumer traveling to the retailer delivering to the consumer. We're moving from linear push supply chains to cyclical pull value chains. We're moving from products to services and experiences. We're moving from ownership to access and from man to machine. Now, I'd like to take you through those different paradigm shifts, if I may. So let's start with the power shifts between the manufacturer and the consumer. So in the fifth wave and all the previous waves, the companies very much decided what you were going to buy and where you were going to buy it from. And the example I like to use is media, because media was the first industry that really felt the impact of the digital transformation and the sort of sixth wave technologies. So we used to be able to clearly identify what we were watching and when we were watching it. And we knew that people who we lived with and who shared the same country as us would pretty much be watching exactly the same things at exactly the same time. So you could go into work the next day and say, hey, did you see the film last night? and they would say either yes or no, because they knew what film you were talking about, because there was only one film on, and it was on in the UK. It would have been on at 9 p.m. in ITV. Now, of course, if you said, did you watch the film last night? People would go, what are you on about? I could have watched any film, any film that's been made over any period of history, because we now live in a Netflix world where the consumer decides not only what they watch, but when they watch it, on what device they watch it. So we've had this huge power shift. And we've seen companies that were wedded to the old way of operating completely fall to one side. And we've seen companies like Netflix or Amazon, for example, that have embraced the new digital way, the consumer-led way, thriving during this period. So one of the things we have found out in this new wave is that convenience is king. If you can make people's life more convenient, they're willing to spend their money on supporting it. And that has changed, things from food delivery services, specifically where companies like Uber Eats or DoorDash or Just Eat have basically found that people are inherently lazy. And actually, if we can bring things to them rather than them having to come to us, then actually we can untap a whole new business model that simply, didn't exist previously. So we look at a sort of macro level, what's really happened here. If you sort of people like myself, who's a Gen X, fifth wave person, and people older than myself, the boomers, we were very much wedded to models that were based around, long-term commitments, asset ownership, and investing for the future. And that's actually been rejected quite heavily now. Some through choice and other things through financial reasons. But what has been embraced is a world of convenience, of instant access and instant gratification, from everything through the music I listen to the media I consume, to getting a ride to go somewhere, to even getting a date for the evening. It's all now been, through digital technology, been made very much available on demand. The problem for supply chain professionals is that supplying this new business model has massively increased the complexity required. So previously we used to have to deliver on schedules to fulfillment centers or to retailers, and we knew where we were going and we were sending stuff in bulk. So it was very much a push supply chain. Now we were actually in a world where effectively the supply chain is a circle with the consumer or the customer at its center, because they're now in control of how they buy things, where they buy things, when they go things. And we're in a 24/7 world. So we've moved from, supply push chains into consumer-centric networks. So for example, in the fifth wave, everyone pretty much I knew spent their weekends going to a supermarket to do this, to stand in a queue trolley full of food, to go to a cashier desk, to take everything out of the trolley, put it on the conveyor belt, have it scanned, put it back into bags back into trolleys, and you went out then. And you would spend a good 3 to 4 hours of your weekend shopping for the week. And the whole supply chain network was set up around this. So most people had cars. We drove to out-of-town stores where we played this game of loading up shopping trolleys, trying to figure out which till was going to go down the quickest. We were at the whim of the retailer. We behaved in ways that they wanted us to behave. And in fact, when I used to work for FMCG companies, the consumer to some degree was almost irrelevant. All the focus was on the customer, on the retailer, on getting gondola end positions, or getting the prime positions on the sort of shelf. But now that's changed. Now, not only does the consumer decide what device they're going to use to buy the goods and when they're going to buy them, but they can now also decide where they want them delivered. So they can actually have them delivered to the boot of the car, or inside their house, or to a smart locker. So now the supply chain of delivering this goods has gone from being bulk delivery to a store to, small deliveries to the consumers. And of course, this changes the paradigms around certain things like reverse logistics, for example. So returns has gone from a very small part of the business where we have a corner of the warehouse for stuff that comes back, into actually in an e-commerce world, that's a huge part of our inventory has to be set aside for managing and processing returns, specifically in things like the apparel industry, where people, specifically women, will buy lots and lots of outfits, not know which size fits because we don't have standard sizes, not sure which outfit they like. But as my wife does, buying maybe 9 outfits, keeps one and 8 of them go back because she had 3 outfits in 3 different sizes to find out which of the 3 outfits she liked and which size she liked. So now suddenly we're finding that large amounts of the stuff that goes out is can no longer be considered just a sale, because a lot of it's actually coming back in again. And we have companies like Amazon that keep ramping up, you know, the name of the game. They keep, you know, increasing the pressure. So they spent a lot of money last year on moving from next day free delivery to same day free delivery. And they're also taking on the supermarkets as well. They want certainly the grocery market. So for the acquisition of things like, you know, Whole Foods, to now partnering with companies like Morrison's, Amazon is trying to, you know, not only be able to sell you things like electronic goods, but also groceries. And that creates an immediate competitive response from the competitors. So the moment Amazon said, we will offer free one-day delivery, then immediately companies like Walmart comes out and says, and we're going to offer the same. Or Tesco's now saying, we're going to do it as well. Now, of course, what this does is this changes the paradigms about what the consumer believes is acceptable. Do you start offering me free same-day delivery? That goes from being exceptional to being my base expectation. My base expectation is now that you will deliver to me where I want for free. And companies that have leveraged that, companies like Amazon, you know, who's moved from, in 20 years, from, you know, a rather geeky looking bookseller to effectively the master of the new e-commerce universe, you know, of creating the everything store. So what Jeff Bezos is trying to do is not to create a retail store. He's trying to create the marketplace, the entire marketplace, the one place you go to buy everything. Your first port of call, the moment something pops in your head that says, we need X, Amazon is where I go to get X. And it's proving to be very good business indeed. So for a long time, people were sort of doubting whether or not Amazon would be successful. But as we see here, you know, it's just been one long upward movement in terms of their revenue. And they've been very clever about the way they do that. They've been locking people into things like Prime membership, which we saw after the last holiday season had reached over 150 million members. Now that's $129 per year spent on Amazon before Amazon has actually sold you anything. So that's just shy over $19 billion in upfront cash flow before they've actually done anything. So that's quite a large innovation slush fund. And from a personal perspective, you know, Jeff Bezos is now the first person ever to be worth 200 billion. So companies who compete against Amazon have a choice. They have a choice like Ocado, for example, who is a UK online retailer that used to partner with Morrison. And the moment Amazon took away the Morrison contract, people, even people like myself, doubted whether or not Ocado would have a future as a retailer. And they themselves agreed that they didn't as a pure retailer. So they focused heavily on innovation. And now Ocado makes more money through selling its robotic warehouse automation to other grocers like Kroger, for example, in the United States, than it does at a pure retail. And those companies that were wedded very much around the old ways of working, such as Sears, no longer exist. So and the reason why they no longer exist is because this move to e-commerce has caused severe disruption in the old retail models. You know, there is a retail apocalypse which was happening before 2020 and has now just speeded up dramatically across the Western world. And even companies that were doing incredibly well, like Zara, are really, really struggling and having to shut around about 1,200 of their stores. So there is this increasing movement of the sort of old physical retail world just dying off at an exponential rate and being replaced by the more online e-commerce businesses. So the place where everyone used to go for their weekends, these shopping malls, the whole sort of the sort of temples that everyone in the 80s, 90s and 2000s used to go and just wander around, are now increasingly, you know, looking like ghost towns. And this is going to increase, specifically these outer town malls, because what's happening in certain city centres is that actually we're moving much more towards pedestrianisation. So the retail high street is going to be not so much more about retail, but more multi-purpose. And we're seeing, you know, these sorts of scenes increasingly arise across cities around Western Europe. And the retail mall itself has realised that people aren't prepared to go somewhere just to shop. So this is the Icon Sound Mall in Bangkok, and I use this because it's a new one and it's a great example. But it's having to fit a whole host of different experiences into the building. So it's not good enough to just have malls. I've got to have floating markets. I've got to have cinemas. I've got to have, you know, a whole host of different things, restaurants, bars, to attract people to come here. People are not going to go to a mall anymore just to buy stuff. Now, this upswing period is a time of exponential technological progress. And the unfortunate thing is we're right at the start of the curve right now. Now, I'd like to use this as an example. So Moravec's paradox is an example of the progress in artificial intelligence. And Hans Moravec was one of the sort of fathers of AI research. And he said, the one thing we've learned over 35 years of research into artificial intelligence is that the things that humans find incredibly difficult to do, advanced calculus, process huge amounts of unstructured data to look for trends, those sorts of things, actually, they're really easy for machines to do. However, interestingly, the things that humans find incredibly easy to do, you know, pick objects up, spatial awareness, color coordinations, those sorts of things, differentiate faces, are incredibly hard to try and automate. And if you go back just 5 years and you look at something like the annual DARPA award ceremony, DARPA being the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency's competition that takes place every year, back in 2015, the sort of best robots in the world struggled with things like walking in a straight line or opening a door. Yet just 2 years later, and we saw Boston Dynamics Atlas robot doing backflips off raised surfaces. And 2 years after that, it was doing parkour and gymnastics. And we saw things like the Spot robot autonomously working, moving through buildings, opening doors for its colleague robots, and robots like the Handle robot in warehouses. So in 4 years, we've gone from I can't walk in a straight line to I can do parkour. That's an incredible amount of technological development in a really small period of time. And this automation is going to be pointed towards the supply chain, and it's going to transform it. It's creating something that I've named the creative destruction triple whammy. Whammy number one is horizontal convergence. So this is the automation of all the things that your human fingers used to do: pick things up, pack things, put things down, pick things out of the ground, or these sort of manual tasks that use huge amounts of physical labor just to do repetitive manual-based jobs, is increasingly being automated. Whammy number two is the one that has most people spooked, because this is the automation of white-collar work, of knowledge-based tasks, the replacement of the cerebral activities of humans into machines. And whammy number three is the convergence of whammy one and whammy two, which is a technological convergence where machine brains are controlling machine hands or machine trucks or, you know, 3D printers across the end-to-end supply chain and being connected together via technology, specifically going to be 5G enabled technology, so that we end up with the automation of the entire end-to-end supply chain. And the real kicker is that all three of these are happening at exactly the same time. So you end up with, for example, a picture that looks like this. Across the supply chain, we have robots that work in agriculture, we have autonomous trucks in mining, we have autonomous ships sailing the fleets, autonomous planes, autonomous ports in manufacture, we have autonomous robotics throughout the factory. We have collaborative robots that can be taught to do things just by showing them. We have 3D printers that can print things like titanium jet engines. We have 3D printers being transformed and disrupted by things like clip printing, which can print solid objects out of liquid. We have 3D printing of things like houses. Then you move into deliver. We see the full automation of the warehouse, which was started off by Amazon and its Kiva bots, moving around, and now we've got ASRS, automated storage and retrieval systems throughout many warehouses, specifically in e-commerce. We've got autonomous trucks coming, drones, road robots that travel around the US, and we can see them in places like Milton Keynes in the UK, and even, you know, road robots in autonomous vans such as Daimler and Starship Robotics mothership concept that they're working on. And then even in the cell, where we've got things like, you know, the ability to use 2D barcode scans to buy products, through to just walk out technology, Pepper robots that are retail robots that can effectively capture all the customer data and record every interaction. We have these FBI listening devices that we've put throughout our houses, such as the Amazon Echoes, where we can just say out loud what we want and Amazon will deliver it, you know, within an hour or 2 hours. And even down to add things like Amazon Dash replenishment, which is small bits of code in things like your Brother printer or your Samsung washing machine or your Brita's water filter, which just automatically places an order with Amazon the moment it realizes that the filter needs replacing or the ink is running low. Now, the interesting thing that makes this wave different to every other wave, and this is a question I get asked a lot, is that, you know, haven't we been here before? Haven't we seen this before? And I say, yes, we have seen before the situations where we automate jobs, but the things that we're using this time aren't just replacing human jobs, they're actually replacing human capabilities. And they're replacing these capabilities for an incredibly low price point. So we see here Baxter and its brother Sawyer, the two robots from Rethink Robotics, selling for around $25,000 each, or Pepper, the retail robot that's available for $1,600 initial rental and then just $200 a month. And the thing is, these are just the first entrants. They're getting smarter all the time. Like your iPhone, they get updated, you know, through continuous software updates. So the robot you buy isn't the robot you end up with. And this whole new wave is creating new expectations, but also new technological solutions. So one of the interesting ones we've seen, and this is a good example of a company that is on top of its game, solving problems rather than just selling products. So Amazon realized that, you know, if it would move into physical retail, it has to do something different than just enter a store. And solved the problem that no one was asking for it to solve, but it realized that actually this was the biggest pain point in most people's shopping experience, which was the bit I mentioned earlier, where you're trying to find a queue to take everything out of the basket, to put it on a belt, put it back into your basket. The bit at the end that adds no value to the consumer is the bit where you have to pay. And Amazon said, what if we didn't have to do that? What if you could just take things off the store and walk out? And that's exactly what they've done with their Amazon Go stores. And the moment they got the concept right, they're now on a massive rollout plan across the US, Germany, London, and even saying, now this technology works, why just our stores? Why can't we sell it to other retailers? And we can put it anywhere. So they're looking to move it into things like airports and movie theaters. So that whole inconvenience bit, and remember what I said earlier, we love convenience. The bit where I have to stand in a queue can now be completely wiped out of the shopping experience. And Amazon's realized that if I can scale this up, if I can scale it up to hypermarket scale, well, then I can completely reinvent the entire shopping experience. So people can go around and pick fresh fruit up, but they haven't got to worry at all about going to the end of it, unpacking everything and repacking it. And that's exactly what they've done. They now have Amazon Fresh grocery stores with these special grocery carts that basically record everything you place in it. Again, this creates an immediate competitive response. And this is why we see such an exponential increase in the level of technological advancement at this time, because the moment your first mover makes it work, the moment the consumer likes it, and once they've experienced it, everyone else has to respond. So the moment Amazon made this work, then we saw Tesco's and Sainsbury's and 7-Eleven and Walmart and Albert Heijn in Europe, you know, basically look at this and go, we have to do this as well. And because Amazon is smart, Amazon has realized that most of these companies can't afford to develop the technology to make this work. So it has a whole new business model simply in selling that technology to these retailers. One of the benefits of this means that now you have stores that are always open, completely automated, and they're now available when it's convenient for you, not when it's convenient for the retailer. So rather than stores shutting at 5 p.m. or 9 p.m. or even 11 p.m. with 7-Elevens, they're now permanently open. You enter via your phone or for a facial scan, you go and you buy what you want just simply by taking it off the shelf and walk out. And as this gentleman here, the brand president from Albert Heijn, identified, this concept not only makes shopping easy, because it's autonomous, we can plug and play stores wherever we want. So we can put stores where it didn't economically make sense to do so before, because we don't actually have to pay for the staff. Now, from an e-commerce perspective, we still have to get the goods to people who live in home. And at the moment, what's being done is we have this gig economy model whereby, you know, Amazon and companies like that are using the gig economy to basically only pay people for when they actually deliver the goods. The trouble is these are disposable and temporary solutions. and also temporary jobs, because ultimately the game plan is to use all of this six-wave technological bounty to automate that last mile, either through drones, autonomous vehicles, road robots with, autonomous vehicles with robots in it, ASRS systems like that one from AutoStore at the bottom there, or the mothership concept that I mentioned earlier. All of these are being primed, ready to go. And in fact, Amazon only in the last month has got approval from the FAA in the US to start rolling out its Prime Air drone service. Road robots like Starship, again, already being proven, already being used, and then growing exponentially. Now, we're in pandemic times, and interestingly, one of the things that this has proven to be has been absolute rocket fuel to this automation revolution, because it's altered the norms of our society. We no longer shake hands when we meet strangers. We no longer hug friends. We no longer work together or eat together or pay by cash. And even things that I used to like doing, if an animal would run up to you like a dog, you can't stroke it anymore because you fear about transmitting something. So the most basic human, concepts have suddenly been stopped. And that's had a big impact on the way we live. It's created what I call not just myself, but a lot of people call the isolation economy. The work from home era has created its own boom market. Rather than me being stood on stage, which I normally would be doing, delivering this presentation, I'm doing it via Zoom. Grocery delivery apps seeing record downloads. We've seen a huge paradigm shift in our business models. Now let's have a look at some of those. So, for example, we've been forced to use online shopping rather than physical or food delivery via restaurants because we've been forced to stay at home. Well, that's created a boom in e-commerce, but it's also led to the death of large shopping malls and change in business models for things like food establishments who now deliver more than they do have people come to their restaurants. We've avoided handling cash, which means the laggards, the people who hadn't embraced things like cashless, contactless payment systems, have suddenly had to embrace it because they don't want to handle physical cash anymore, and the retailer doesn't want to handle physical cash. We want things on demand now. So there's been an increase in the demand for 1-hour delivery offerings, which is pushing for more automated urban warehouses. People want delivery robots and drones more than humans because, again, even if someone delivers something to your door, we're still going through this process of having to wipe everything down with antibacterial wipes. Whereas if we use machines, we don't have that sort of transmission fear. People have found a new love for locally produced goods and services. So things that have actually thrived in this time have been, local farm shops, local bakeries, these sorts of things. People have realized that actually, things taste better if they're local. So there has been a massive boom in things like, these local shops, which is going to create a boom in things like vertical automated farming. So being able to grow crops all year round locally. Working from anywhere has become the new norm. There's been a massive increase in telepresence and remote working boom. This is just going to increase once 5G gets rolled out, and that's caused a reduction in congestion and traffic and car parking, those sorts of things. And the car parking one I'm going to come back to later. We now socially distance and avoid loud gatherings, which means there's been a massive drop, almost a complete wipeout of group-based activities such as cinema and theatres. But there has been a massive boom in home-based entertainment, things like, from Netflix to virtual reality and gaming. And we tend now to minimize human-to-human contact. So things like cashierless just walk out shopping is actually going to be, massively embraced because it's going to be what the consumer wants. They want the convenience, but actually I don't really want, anyone else to touch these goods. And the companies that are ready to take advantage of this shift, such as Amazon, have just seen their sales explode. So Amazon has reported, despite its massive exponential growth in its sales, Q2 2020, it posted just shy of 90 billion in that quarter alone. Its AWS sales have gone up 29% as people have moved, wanted more cloud computing power because people were working from home. Its subscriptions to Amazon Prime have gone up 29%. So it's just taken full advantage of this. Now, with all of this disruption and all of this paradigm shifts, one of the things we've actually figured out is that humans are generally too slow in order to be able to process this amount of data. Our old forecasting tools are inaccurate. Our planning cycles are too infrequent. These black swans are becoming far too common. Our behavior is far too irrational, and our expectations are now too demanding for humans to be able to plan and manage. So now our supply chains need to adapt in real time, and we need help to do this. And that's where whammy number 2 comes in, the automation of knowledge work. So we have been seeing for a number of years companies toy around with artificial intelligence, planning and schedule systems. And now companies like, Era, which I will talk about in a moment, have just seen a massive demand for this. Companies like Amazon that spend a lot of money on this are saying we're now almost at the point where we can pretty much guarantee we know what you're going to buy before you buy it. But certainly for your sort of regular goods, why don't we just send you those? Why don't you even leave the whole buying process to us, and we'll just send you what we think we know you need, and you can just tweak it as you want. And what we're seeing because of this is we're seeing the evolution of a sort of self-aware, self-driving cognitive supply chain. We've moved very quickly to sort of level 1 analysis, which is basically saying we're describing what's happening here. So level 1 analysis is I can tell you what's going on in your supply chain. Great. That's a bit like being told that you're in a traffic jam. Thanks for the information, but I kind of already knew. Level 2 is predictive. So we're able to tell you in this example, that you're about to hit a traffic jam, which again, from a supply chain perspective, it's good, it's better. It's telling you they're potentially likely to have an issue here. We're likely to run out of stock. We're likely to have a long lead time. Where we really want to be is level 3 and level 4. Level 3 is prescriptive action. So this is basically, we're not only able to tell you there's an issue up ahead, but we're able to give you some options. And level 4 is, not only do we know there's going to be an issue that you don't know about yet, but we've already processed all the options, and this one's the best one. So if you think level 1 and level 2 is basically humans making decisions using data that's presented to them from the machines, level 3 is humans making decisions using recommendations from machines, and level 4 is basically machines making the decisions and then telling us afterwards what they've done. The thing is, we're already at level 4. It's already here. Systems like Era, the cognitive operating system, has already been rolled out by companies like Merck and Unilever and Johnson & Johnson, and is on an exponential growth. And you're able to communicate with that technology by voice. So rather than having to do, write code or write pieces of analysis, you simply ask it questions. Now, right now, we want this to be what I call a glass box solution. We want to be able to understand how you came up with the number you came up with. We prefer that over a black box solution whereby the artificial intelligence planning system just tells us what to do, because we don't trust it yet. But as the amount of data dramatically increases, as the algorithms get incredibly more complicated, the reality is we're not going to know what it's done, even if it tells us. We don't understand, the calculations. So as we move towards, the 5G enabled world where everything has a sensor on everything, we're going to get to this position where we reach this sort of black box solution faster than we think. And we will have to trust the algorithms, and we'll have to trust the output, because we simply won't be able to understand it even if it told us. So the world we're approaching is one that looks a bit like this. Robots are going to do the making and moving. Things like the blockchain, which I haven't discussed because the whole subject in itself, will do the recording. Tools like robot process automation will do all the back office transactions. Chatbots and digital assistants will handle the queries. And AI control towers will analyze data, identify issues, and recommend solutions to the humans. And as I said earlier, we're at the start of this, so we haven't really seen anything yet. Both robots and AI are both on an exponential curve. And in fact, all the pandemic has done, and these graphs were produced way before the pandemic, is just accelerated that. And once we see things like quantum computing, which, we reached the point of quantum supremacy, last year, where, and for those who don't know, the point of quantum supremacy is where a quantum computer is able to answer a question where no amount of time or processing power using traditional computers would have enabled it to do that. And Quantum claimed that point via its Sycamore computer, which basically took 200 seconds to solve a problem that they believed that the most powerful computer in the world would have took 10,000 years to complete. So it reached that point of quantum supremacy. The quantum computer can solve a problem that no amount of traditional processing power could solve. And once they've done that, then immediately companies like Volkswagen said, great, let's use this. And they used it in this example to handle autonomous buses that were set up around a conference, to route these autonomous buses. And because this is going to be incredibly needed when we move towards autonomous vehicles, if we're going to have millions of vehicles communicating with traffic lights and with each other and sensing and responding everything that's going on, we don't have enough traditional computing power to process that. We will need things like, quantum computers. Now, interestingly, quantum computers is the progress is moving faster than the Moore's law that drove the power of computer development, which was what powered the fifth wave. So Harmut Nevin, who is a director of engineering at Google and was responsible for that achievement of reaching quantum supremacy, says he expects all machine learning to be running on quantum computers in the next 10 years. And he said that a couple of years ago. Now, to give you an idea of what double exponential looks like, this is the processing power of Moore's law. And remember, Moore's law is exponential. This is exponential technological development. The processing powers of computers have gone through an exponential curve. That's Nevin's law. That's the rate of progress they're achieving in quantum computing. And as you can see, it's significantly different. You know, we are talking about a huge level of progress. And in fact, just this week, and I haven't got it in my presentation, but they've managed to do something called quantum realization, which is quantum computers can solve problems, but we don't understand whether or not it's right or not because it's too complicated. And an Israeli, I think it was an Israeli, I may be incorrect, 28-year-old graduate actually figured out how to get quantum computers to explain how they did what they did, and so that we can actually follow and make sure that it was, you know, we understand it. And then you move on to Whamm number 3, which is the alignment of these technologies. So you end up with a model that looks a little bit like this. We have, you know, artificial intelligence variants driven predominantly over things like quantum computing, you know, controlling, monitoring and managing robotics, autonomous vehicles, you know, loads and loads of 5G enabled devices everywhere, the internet of everything. So we're capturing data from every movement across the end-to-end supply chain, bringing it into effectively an AI control tower, processing it, looking for any deviations, highlighting them, coming up with recommendations, and basically advising the humans what to do. The adoption of 5G this year and next year is going to be exponential. Reason being is that there's a massive pull from industry because they want this Internet of Everything world. And as you can see there, that newspaper headline at the bottom, you know, the pandemic once again is sort of fast forwarding the adoption in the United States. Especially they want things like track and trace. They want to put these sorts of tools in place where we track people's movements. They're going to be using 5G to do that. So we're going to end up with a supply chain which is effectively self-driving and self-adapting, where we have sensors on everything from an industrial world, you know, from wind turbines to autonomous vehicles to 3D printers, robotics, etc. And also sensors in all of our consumables, our clothing, our watches, our devices, our TVs, all of these things communicating with each other. So as we see, for example, an increase in power consumption, then that can drive, immediately be picked up and drive an increase in power generation, for example. One of the things that's helping this is the concept of something called digital twins. So these sensors everywhere are allowing us to replicate the physical in a digital world. So we can not only see what's going on digitally in the real world, but we can also do things like simulate. Be that, you know, simulate the movement of people or simulate the performance of an engine or a machine or a pipeline. So by putting sensors everywhere, we can start to really understand what's actually going on in our supply chain, you know, from everything from the movement of people to the movement of goods and services. Now, where does that take us? Well, that takes us to a place where the supply chain of the past, which was, you know, the best supply chain in the world, was the invisible supply chain, the one we didn't hear about. So the CEO never used to be that interested in the supply chain unless things went wrong, and then he wanted to know what you're going to do to fix it. That was the extent of the interest. Now companies are realizing that actually the supply chain is real competitive advantage, and the best supply chain in the world in the sixth wave is the one that's completely visible and completely transparent. What do I mean by visibility? This word gets thrown around all over the place. We need more visibility. What do you mean by visibility? Well, we need firstly the visibility of flows. Of course, the flow of physical product for our end-to-end supply chain, but also the flow of information. And finally, the flow of money. We want to see these financial transactions. And as we move to things like cyber currency, this is going to become both incredibly, somewhat easier, but much more important. Because we're now able to have visibility of our flows, that gives us visibility of our costs and our risks. We can start to see consumption of energy and water. We can start to see where our waste is in our supply chain through, you know, unnecessary movements, or from, you know, things that can be optimized through being able to simulate the supply chain in these digital environments. But we can also see where our risks are, our weak spots, and our constraints. We can also see one thing that has become increasingly important over the last few years, especially as things like Extinction Rebellion has been sort of highlighting the sort of climate change implications. We can see the impact of the supply chain from an ethical perspective. And there we've seen pictures of things like the Rana Plaza disaster, which happened in 2013, where people in the West who'd embraced the concept of disposable fashion suddenly realized that actually that disposable fashion came at a cost. And that cost was disposable lives. The ecological side of it as well, the impact from an ecological perspective, but also the economic impact, and seeing whether or not there's any sort of dodgy dealings or money movements that we don't want to find out about once the regulators have got involved. Now, we have this whole new concept of this new e-commerce supply chain, but we actually need new infrastructure. So companies like Amazon are looking at the future and say, how do we develop completely new ways of supporting this new on-demand e-commerce world? And these are some of the patents that Amazon's got out there and has had out there for a number of years. For everything from drone hives, where we have these sort of vertical sort of hives where drones will fly out and deliver goods to consumers in urban centers, through to warehouses that float above city centers, so the goods only basically have to move pretty much vertically, down to underwater storage. So they're storing devices underwater and then using basically certain sounds to call the right case back to the surface. So they're thinking really big and really futuristic about how they can support these, urban e-commerce on-demand requirements. But there might be a simpler option in the interim, or even for longer term, which is, can we look at some of the things that are being disrupted? Can we look at some of the things that are being impacted by the destruction side, or even just ideas that used to exist, and to use them to provide the infrastructure of the future? Now, Amazon, once again, that name keeps coming up, is looking at this and has realized that, yes, there is a massive opportunity. So Amazon has been going around quite quietly, buying a lot of these old derelict malls, these abandoned mall departments, and even things like abandoned Sears or JCPenney stores or Toys R Us stores, because they actually realized that these big empty spaces would make really good fulfillment centers. And there is 4 benefits to companies like Amazon and to the other e-commerce retailers of using these as out-of-town fulfillment centers. The first is obviously their size. They're big. They haven't got to build anything as well. They exist. They've been designed specifically to be close to population centers. They've been designed specifically to have great transport links, because people used to have to travel by car to get them. And they have all the pre-existing infrastructure. So they're plumbed up for water, for electricity, they're for sewage. They have all of that existing. And they're usually going cheap, because there is completely empty, and there is a company that owns them and really doesn't know what to do with this box that people used to go to, continuously during the 90s and 2000s. So if these become the new fulfillment centers of the future, how do we still move these goods from these out-of-town fulfillment centers towards the more urban, smaller fulfillment centers to meet these 1 hour, 2 hour delivery promises, without, again, just having vast numbers of trucks clogging up the roads? Well, to do that, we need to go back. We need to look at maybe how we used to do things. So this is a map of the pneumatic tube network that sits underneath Paris, where things were passed around, all of those different nodes you saw there pneumatically. And in fact, there was one of those that sat under Paris and Munich and Prague and London and Berlin. So we used to send stuff using pneumatic tubes across, city centers. And they used to look a little bit like this. And in fact, some of them were big enough to carry people in. That didn't last particularly long. That one there with the people in was in from New York. But again, it looked like this. So we used to move goods using tubes that networked across the city center. And in fact, they used to carry everything through to live animals. Now, people have been looking at that and going, actually, that was a pretty good idea. We haven't done it for a while, but actually the concept is good. Can we reinvent that concept but using new technologies? And it looks a little bit like this. So we're now seeing companies backed by organizations like Ocado are looking at saying, can we build these tunnels or even use some of the existing ones to travel goods underground from these large fulfillment centers all the way through to the smaller urban fulfillment centers where then they can pick up to the last mile. Let's have a look at that.
The progress of technology accelerates at incredible speed. Magway is at the cutting edge of this revolution. Having developed the most game-changing goods and parcels transport system in the world, utilising existing pipe technologies with our world-renowned experience of magnetic motors. A system that will travel beneath and above ground for a pipe network, connecting distribution centres to consolidation centres, targeting the market for logistics, especially e-commerce, parcel and grocery delivery. With only half a second between carriages, efficiency and reliability is ensured. Easy integration to existing facilities, high bandwidth across the country, 24/7, to meet an ever-increasing urban demand. Autonomous transit, sustainable infrastructure with zero emissions, improved air quality, reduced congestion, less packaging, fewer road accidents, all weather, making better use of space, creating opportunities for denser, more vertical, residential and commercial development. Improved customer service, efficient, predictable, saving costs in operations, saving costs in capital investment, creating a new delivery utility for the UK and for the rest of the world, delivering faster for a better tomorrow, delivering the future today. Magway.
And in fact, Magway and the UK is not the only place that idea is being used. So the Cargo Souterrain project, £33 billion infrastructure project, Switzerland is looking at building tunnels between all of its sort of major cities and moving all of these goods effectively underground, moving all the freight and all these clogged roads and taking them off the roads and putting them down into these tunnels. And it's, started work on this already. Again, the Hyperloop concept, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, Elon Musk sort of launched this. Again, DP World, just back in July, passed legislation to start to deploy these Hyperloop systems. And again, people are looking at coronavirus and saying, all that has done is accelerated the desire in order to have, contactless, fast, e-commerce driven delivery mechanisms. And, let's look to the future. But can we reinvent some of these concepts like pneumatic tubes in order to move goods seamlessly, quickly between these, major fulfillment centers and these smaller consolidation centers or small urban warehouses? Now, we're moving them to these small urban micro logistics centers. Well, that's actually a problem in itself because these things are, land is quite expensive in these areas. How do you do that? How do you build a massive warehouse in the middle of a city center? And the answer is you don't build a massive warehouse.
This is the first Common Sense Robotics micro-fulfillment center. It is operated by hundreds of robots, fulfills thousands of orders every single day, and delivers over 10,000 different types of products to online customers around it.
Up until today, robotic fulfillment centers take up anywhere between a size of 4 football fields to about 20 football fields. And you just can't fit that into a city. Our first site, the site that we are in, is actually 1/10 of a football field in size.
In order to fit our site into small, tight urban spaces, we've designed every single element of it to optimize for space efficiency. We have hundreds of robots of different types traveling in all directions, whether it is on the ground or on the shelving units. And they can meet each other anywhere on the map. And that really enables us to fulfill the full set of what's needed for a grocery basket out of this site.
A typical order would take less than 5 minutes to fulfill end-to-end. So 5 minutes from the moment the consumer places that order online to the moment that that order is ready for dispatch and goes to delivery.
So our vision for the future is actually a network of micro-fulfillment centers in the centers of cities that support each other and enable us to move things faster, more accurately.
When you order groceries online, you would get these groceries in less than 1 hour to your doorstep. As simple as that.
That's common sense robotics. And you can see how the plan is there is to build these sort of micro logistics centers in this sort of network that basically just generally overlap at the edges, so that you always can guarantee that you can get delivery from one of those within that sort of 1 hour, 2 hour window. But one of the problems is, of course, you know, land in city centers is hugely prohibitive. It's incredibly expensive to buy real estate in the city. So even if the fulfillment center is automated, so we don't need the same sort of labor, but we, you know, ultimately, and it's smaller, so we don't need the same amount of land, we still need land. So, you know, it's still going to be relatively prohibitive. So where in cities could we acquire land that doesn't cost us a huge amount of money?
What are underutilized spaces in cities that have reasonable rents that can enable 2-hour delivery of almost any item to a consumer?
Parking lots in dense urban areas have such an untapped potential to them.
We did this report, and just in 5 U.S. cities, we found over $80 billion in parking. Across all 5 cities, supply was greater than demand. In some cases, there were 60% just empty parking stalls.
The amount of parking lots underutilized across the United States of America is staggering. People are consuming transportation as a service rather than as an asset. And this is impacting the way we think about infrastructure. If I don't own a car, I don't need to park it.
I think the demand for parking will continue to decline because people are using Uber and Lyft and getting around without their own cars.
I think you'll start seeing all this great space that traditionally was utilized just for cars in the middle of really dense areas being utilized for other applications.
A parking structure or underground facility, that's tricky, right? It's not that livable. It's deep, doesn't get a lot of natural light. But spaces like that are already in the right location because it was convenient for someone to park.
So if we can find a way to turn those parking lots into distribution locations, and they're spread all over New York, all over Chicago, all over Boston, and we can turn them into micro logistics locations, well, boom, we've managed to find ourselves not within 2 hours of every consumer, but 10 minutes of every consumer.
We are utilizing underground parking lots that cost us a fraction compared to a store 6 or 12 feet above us, which allows us to create more value to our customers and these customers to their customers.
We're going to transform a lot of real estate in the 21st century with this drive of e-commerce. And by making better usage out of it, we can lower costs in cities, which we need to do. We can reduce pollution in cities, which we need to do. And we can make the city work for so many more of its residents by bringing these services closer to every part of the population, and not only to those who can afford it by paying a premium price.
And so if you live in a city and you can get your groceries faster and cheaper than going to the supermarket, that's pretty valuable. And that's what we're here to do.
So again, a great opportunity. We've got all of this parking space, which as we move from consuming transportation as an asset, buying a car, to transportation as a service, can be potentially repurposed without costing huge amounts. But it's allowing us to think about whole new business models. It said, well, could we combine that underground car parking with the surface buildings into urban malls? So effectively, the mall has its own robotic fulfillment center, and we can have these multi-purpose centers. And that's exactly what's happening. So for example, in London, an old underground 70s car park in the heart of London's been turned into a sort of £100 million shopping complex. So that car parks could effectively become the next gold mine from a land perspective. And what we're likely to end up with is pictures like this, and this comes from AutoStore, where we see a fulfillment center underground that feeds stores above it, and before on top of them you could have everything from restaurants to cinemas to entertainment complexes to whatever. So they become completely multi-purpose and self-contained within themselves. And in fact, what we're able to do here, because of this nature of this automation technology, you could now have a physical store where all of the attention is on the consumer experience. And there's none of this going off into the back room to try and find goods. We could effectively turn the stores into a combined fulfillment hub for e-commerce deliveries, but also to support the physical deliveries where, for example, in footwear, you go up, you scan the shoe, and rather than the assistant disappearing for 20 minutes trying to find the right size, it just automatically comes down. And all the attention then is on the consumer. So you can see how we can start to use these technologies to create these sort of omni-channel sort of hubs and reinvent the whole retail experience. So a new supply chain is effectively emerging, one that I've been called the PAL supply chain. We've called this for a number of years now. Incredibly personalized product, service, and experience, automated manufacturing, delivery, and planning, but also incredibly local production, storage, and retail facilities. And there's big benefits to this PAL supply chain. The shorter the supply chain, the more resilient, responsive, agile, and sustainable it is. And a lot of companies have made that realization due to the pandemic. We're going to see labor costs come down because we're not going to see the same volume of labor. Production costs are going to come down because we're only going to need to make what we need. We're going to reduce inventory and waste. Transportational costs down because we're going to be doing transportation using these new methods that are effectively going to be driven by electricity. Storage costs, again, we're going to store what we need. Energy and water consumption will come down because of all the sensors we have everywhere. And also lead times will drop dramatically. Huge impact and opportunities across the way from all of these, from the personalizations perspective, through to the automation side, through to the localization, and in sustainability. You can look at all of these as a threat to your existing business model, or you can look at all of these as a massive opportunity. But you have to realize that the disruption has only just begun. We are only at the start of this curve. And unfortunately for most people, you know, their leadership is still very much in the downswing thinking where change was linear. Now we're in the upswing. Most of our leaders and businesses were trained in the downswing. They were trained how to control their organization, how to, you know, manage costs, manage expectations, not how to disrupt their organization, how to change and transform it. So what we're seeing is a lot of these fifth wave downswing behaviors still dominate most of our businesses. And when I talk to companies about what is the barriers that stops them from, you know, innovating in their organization, I get the same old, which is a constant short-term profit-focused mindset in the organization. If we talk about innovation, we need to do it in such a way that shows an immediate return on investments. We've got this same old problem we've had for years of silo metrics, silo targets, and silo behaviors. Is this constant pressure to meet quarterly analyst expectations. We've got silo behaviors, agendas, and metrics are so bad, I've mentioned them twice. We've got a general fear of taking risks and a lack of a long-term vision, which generally means the organization is playing not to lose rather than to win. And what we're seeing is because they have those same behaviors, when these companies are rushing like a gold mine towards all of these digital technologies, they're wasting most of their money. So 9 out of 10 of digital transformation projects fail, or 84% in this, some people are quoting. So just because you've got a digital project does not make you a digital company. And as I've said many years now, a company without a customer-centric strategy or any understanding about how all these wonderful tools will enable your strategy is just a company that's going to waste a lot of money. You see, digital is not a project. It is a journey, not a destination. It is a paradigm shift in the organization's mindset, an opportunity to redefine what it stands for, how it operates, and what it rewards. A successful digital transformation is actually really not to do with technology. It's about transforming the mindset, culture, and strategy of the organization. You see, the whats and hows of technology really only make sense when you look at applying them to a very compelling why, and that why has to be customer focused. So companies really need to go through a Copernican business revolution where they stop putting themselves at the center of the universe and expecting the customer to surround them and circle them, which was the old fifth wave thinking, to a new world where we actually say the customer is at the heart. They have choices and they have expectations, and we need to circle those and understand those, because if we don't, we're going to be left behind. We have moved from a world where companies used to compete to a world where in 2001, Martin Christopher said, you know, my colleague Cranfield said, you know, companies don't compete, supply chains compete. That's no longer true anymore. Now business models compete. The supply chain is obviously an absolutely critical part of that in that network section there, but it's really about your business models, putting a compelling value proposition in the hands of a certain customer segment and having the right aligned execution capabilities and a clear strategy to deliver. So the role of technology in the sixth wave is really to reimagine, redesign, and refine your business model. Can we use it to create more compelling value propositions? Can we use it to help understand our customer needs better? Can we help to improve the effectiveness of delivery in the supply chain? Or can we improve the efficiency and accuracy of our execution? So yes, this is what you should be asking yourselves when you look at these technologies. So I'd like to leave yourself with a quote from my book. I think that's probably a little bit erring towards the arrogant side, but I shall quote myself nevertheless. If you had to rebuild your company today, knowing now how people use technology, what their expectations are and how they behave, what they value, and also what is technically possible, would it resemble the company you currently work in? Because if it doesn't, then the challenge really is to change before a new competitor arrives that does exactly all of that and takes away your business. You see, these waves of creative destruction are both opportunity and threat. They are creation and destruction. But the choice of which one of those is yours to make. But the one thing is for sure, doing nothing is not an option. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely fascinating. And I guess it begs a number of questions. We've had some questions through on the Q&A, and I'm sure there will be quite a few more as we sort of spend the next 15 minutes covering some of them. And amongst the sort of Q&A questions are a couple of themes sort of emerging, and I'll try and sort of paraphrase here, but where do we humans fit in this picture here? What would you advise the millions of people working in logistics and transport today? What should they be doing?
Well, it's interestingly enough, that's a question I get asked quite a lot. Most people listen to that. Where do we fit? And in fact, it was that sort of question that actually led me to certainly write a book that looked into the social and economic ramifications of this, because those were exactly the questions I always got. I never got questions about, you know, how do I implement that robotic system, or how do I get my hands on that collaborative robot, or how do I do blockchain? It was about, what does this mean? Where's this taking us? And of course, you know, you've read the book. There were some pretty interesting directions that things can go to. Where do humans fit in? Well, human skills, our traditional human skills, are actually more valuable than ever before. So the human skills are things like, you know, collaboration, of inquiry, of analysis, of team building, of, you know, human to human customer service. Those sorts of things are going to become incredibly more valuable. We're going to have more data at our fingertips than ever before, and making sense of that, we're going to need to use artificial intelligence tools to be able to do that. But seeing the opportunity, seeing the new business model, seeing the new way we can redesign our supply chain, seeing the new opportunity to deliver something of value is not going to be automated anytime soon. That still needs, you know, human intelligence to do that. And just because the new arrives doesn't mean the old goes away. And I use an example in my book where, you know, if you think we can now have 3D printers that can build houses, very immature technology. But that doesn't mean the moment they can do that, that every house that's ever been built suddenly disappears off the face of the earth. Every house that's ever been built is still going to need an electrician, still going to need plumbing, still going to need, you know, decorators, still going to need, all of those things are still going to be required for a very, very long time, because they're very hard to automate. And you know, I really, you know, I struggle to see, you know, how you're going to be able to automate things like plumbing or painting and decorating. So there are going to be a lot of skills that just aren't disrupted at all. But from a supply chain perspective, I think the question was very much about the supply chain. If you know, the sort of traditional management on supervisory roles of people picking, packing, loading, they're not going to be there. And certainly other skills like, you know, old school forecasting is not going to be there in the same way. What we're finding in this new wave is actually there's going to be more skills, but actually going to be much higher. They're going to need a much higher degree of cerebral capability and a much more deeper thought process. And one thing that isn't going to work is this command and control model. It just isn't. You're going to have to put the power of this technology in the hands of your team and basically let them free in order to be able to use the outputs of all this technology to be able to find, you know, new opportunities or be able to solve issues that have existed for a very long time. So it's a different set of skills. I think if your job is tied up in just these, you know, just picking, packing, loading, dripping, driving, the next 10 years isn't looking very good for you, unfortunately. But if you can move beyond that and offer more than that, then I think there's still very much a human role. And I think if you put humans and computers together, it becomes a very powerful combination.
Absolutely, absolutely. Fully understand and fully agree with that. But I think obviously it's a pertinent question for a lot of people out there.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a couple of other sort of questions here, which is which I guess is related to the retail industry. As you quite rightly pointed out, there's been a massive shift towards e-commerce from the sort of traditional high street retailers. But interestingly enough, and I think you and I discussed it at some point over the summer, there's also been a shift towards the local corner shops that seem to be doing it very well. Is that part of this sort of more distributed approach, local approach, the personal service elements that we're still seeking and wanting?
Yeah, I think there's twofold to that. I think, you know, in terms of the PAL model I've been talking about, you know, I think the local shop that can offer a much more personal service a local shop that's going to do very well. If you can differentiate, if you buy a shop and put stuff in it and you're just a commodity seller, you're probably not going to do as well as you could do. The reason why it's took off recently is because people aren't traveling very far. The whole move to a out-store supermarket, going to supermarkets, that's kind of completely died a death, really. And you know, companies like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Carrefour's, all these have gone to, you know, to sort of the online delivery services. So there has been a sort of a pandemic push towards just being able to walk somewhere local. But I think what a lot of companies like farm shops, as I mentioned in my talk, have realized that people have suddenly realized that they've had little gold mines on their doorsteps. They've had, you know, the butchers, which they'd never really gone to before because they've always bought their meat in bulk from, you know, the local supermarket. But now they've gone to the butchers, they've realized, hang on, this is a higher quality product by someone who lives locally, who, you know, can tell me more about the meat than just give it to me, you know, and they're experiencing sort of higher quality products, realizing that actually, you know, these things here, the convenience of buying from them actually is not that inconvenient. You know, if I'm off on the street locally anyway, but I normally would have passed them by because I drove past it in my car on the way to the supermarket. So I think if there is a goldmine of opportunity for companies that offer more than just stuff, that actually offer value, that can differentiate, that can really bring uniqueness to it. And I think that's always been the case. Technology washes away in these waves of creative destruction. The businesses that don't offer anything greatly of value, you know, the also brands, and that's where companies like Amazon are just amping up the pressure, because, you know, by being able to solve problems that no one was asking them to solve, but they realised were major points of inconvenience to the consumers, they're just continually changing the very nature of the game. So you can't just be, you know, a commodity seller. You have to be a value deliverer.
And another theme that's sort of bubbling up here in the Q&A is of course, I mean, not all countries, all regions of the world are going to be impacted by these disruptions and changes equally or at the same time. Yeah. So will we see winners and losers in this? Will we see even bigger differences in the sort of world economy as we know it today?
Yeah. It's one of my biggest worries, actually. It's going to, well, I think it's going to end up causing some very large sort of macro shifts, like population movement, for example. If you take autonomous cars, road robots, whatever, you know, they require a certain level and maturity of infrastructure in order to operate, and they also require a certain level of I guess behavioural social contracts within the population, that, you know, you're not going to steal them, damage them, break them, whatever. You know, you'll just let them go about their service. So you can see them taking off in very, you know, very well developed areas of the world, but you would struggle to see where, you know, in places which are less developed, where roads don't exist very well, for example, where, you know, where there are no rules, there are no structured rules for it to follow. These things like rules, they need rules. If you don't have any rules, for example, you know, sometimes when I'm driving around in Africa, you know, cars will go up on the pavements and the puts will come in and out and all that sort of stuff. You can't almost imagine how, you know, an autonomous car is going to deal with that. It's going to be a long time before it's going to be able to deal with that. But I also think that the localization side of it has a real challenge for the emerging economies, because it's going to be, I think it's going to pull a lot of manufacturing away from them. You're going to see an increase of, you know, of this reshoring movement that's been taking place for a number of years now. Pandemics, again, is just going to accelerate that again. A lot of companies and a lot of countries found that, you know, we've lost control of our supply chain. We've chased the cheap labor, but actually when we needed it, it wasn't there. We didn't have control, our PPE or whatever, we didn't have our fingertips. And actually a lot of companies and a lot of countries have realized that we're not going to allow that to happen again. We're going to bring it back within our sort of sphere of influence, within sort of what we call profitable proximity. And that's going to be something that I think is probably a concern to a lot of emerging nations that are expecting their own industrial revolution. They're expecting the opportunity to move from villages into cities to do jobs with these for small amounts of money, you know, and get myself onto the middle class so I can not only make an iPhone, I can earn an iPhone and own an iPhone. That might not be there. That might not be there because, you know, once the West starts to embrace a lot of these technologies, the unit cost will drop dramatically. And I think a lot of the emerging nations will have to pay catch up as well. And they will have to also embrace some of these. So it will leave, I think it will cause some major socioeconomic disruptions and unfortunately quite a bit of poverty, I think, in some respects. I mean, you know, there's, it's one of the, I've got a chapter in my book, you probably remember, called A Revolution for Me, but Not for Thee. Which talks all about that.
No, I do, absolutely, yeah. And in terms of, you touched briefly on it, Sean, which was the question around sustainability in supply chain.
Yes.
And other sort of factors impacting. How big an influence do you think that's going to be in this sort of sixth wave?
I think it's going to be big. I think it's huge. I mean, we've seen in the UK this week or with the weekend with, you know, Extinction Rebellion protesters disrupting. They're making a lot of noise. It's not something. Climate change is not something that's going to go away. Pressures on organisations to be seen to be doing something is not going to go away. You know, we're going to continue to see movements towards renewables. I think, you know, but we have got problems because, I mean, California, for example, at the moment is having massive power outages because it had pushed for renewable energy, and it replaced a lot of its old, I guess, carbon-based power generation sources for renewables, and then suddenly found that it couldn't meet certain peaks of demand, so it's had huge problems. And I think that the problem is not necessarily now generation, but storage. And I mean, I know Elon Musk was working in Australia to try and solve some of their South Australia, Western Australia, to solve some of their outage problems through creating effectively gigafactories of storage, power storage banks. But once we crack that, and once quantum computing gets involved in some of these calculations, I think we'll crack that. I think the things we saw with like Magway, where you've got you know, electric, autonomous, effectively these drone traveling in through tunnels underneath, that will take a lot of trucks off the roads. I think we're moving increasingly towards electric anyway as a method of transport, with overcoming some of that range anxiety as the infrastructure gets laid down. So I think it will be increasing amount of pressure. I also think that companies will look at automation as a way to have washed their hands of a lot of the bad press and bad practices of the past, where they've, you know, made apparel in Bangladesh using effectively slave labor. I think there's been a lot more focus on things like slave labor recently, and you know, automation provides them a get out rather than paying better wages and more providing better conditions. It provides them with a get out that says, well, actually, I'll just automate it.
And I guess sort of finally, we've got a few minutes left here. You're a fellow of the Institute. How do you see the Institute sort of develop through this sixth wave? What do we need to do for our members and people in our profession? Other than, of course, doing this webinar, which is a good thing, create awareness. But as an institute, as a professional organization, a professional body, how do you see that?
Well, I think, you know, everyone's facing the same challenges here. You know, I focus on companies like Amazon, organizations like that. They're in control. They've got their act together. They know what they're doing. The challenge everyone else has is sort of, you know, I think it's defined once as the free box model. We've got to, you know, we've got to control the present, we've got to create the future, and we've got to manage the transition. And every organization is trying to do that. It's got to change the wheels on the bus while it's in motion, effectively. So we've got to, you need help to understand where the future is going and understand how to take, you know, the skills and the resources in order to embrace the future, not embrace the past. But we also need to control the business as usual. We still need a lot of skills to control business as usual. But our leaders need skills around managing that transition. How do we move from that old model into that new model? Which things do I need to move and which can I leave alone? And we have a problem as a species of overvaluing what we know and undervaluing what we don't know. There's a great quote from Mark Twain that I love that says, you know, it ain't what you know it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think that's where, you know, I think that's where the CILT can come in. It can come in. It can, you know, create clarity about, you know, where things are going and allow them to see the opportunities, but also still provide the skills needed to manage the current reality. But actually would suggest also highlighting the skills that are likely to be impacted by this wave, so people can manage the transition and got the skills for the future.
So education and awareness.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Absolutely. Yeah,
should be key themes. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think we're just on time. Keith, are you stepping in now? Final words? Or Jasper, perhaps?
Thanks, Jan. I'm stepping in now, I think. So hopefully you can see me. Always helps if you unmute. So, yeah, that was absolutely, thank you, Jan, for covering the chairman's role today and for asking those questions. I'm sorry to attendees, we've been a bit limited for time, but I'm sure you're, certainly for questions, but I'm sure you agree that was absolutely splendid to hear Sean for the time that we did hear him. And can I, on his behalf, here is my copy of Transition Point.
Absolutely.
I'm still in the age of supply chain professionals that deal with paper, but there is also an audio book. So, and that's only been recently released. So do get a chance. It's a big tome, but it's really readable. So do look at how you get copies of that. Pick up some of those themes. Yeah, Jan's got the audio version there.
I got the audio,
we can see. Excellent, excellent. Lots of takeaway from that. Just splendid in terms of really challenging our thinking, and yeah, take that back into your institutes globally and into your businesses, because obviously it's a big world out there and it affects us in many different ways. So thank you, those who are joining us. I see many of the usual, and I think we've had a lot on Facebook. You can join us again in 2 weeks' time, where we have the next generation leading our webinar. That's going to come from all around the world, but also again with quite an African emphasis. So put that in your diaries, 2 weeks from today for the next webinar in our series, and we're continuing these webinars through the autumn period. So I'll finish up just by thanking Sean again for his magnificent presentation. Thank you, Sean.
My pleasure.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you, Jan, for chairing, and good afternoon, good evening, good night around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.